This is a workshop in which an individual gets a chance to not only discover the scientific research about the nature of consciousness, but to actually have the experiences. You can't you can't really understand this material just intellectually. You have to experience it. Once you have experienced it, then it all becomes much clearer. So what I've tried to do with this workshop is put together a package in which there is a period of intellectual material so that you really come to grasp what has been done and what we know through science to be real. And then you have an experience that allows you to integrate what you've just heard into your own experience, into your own life. The workshop in its totality is called Opening to the Infinite because it's about that aspect of consciousness that is not limited by space or time, that allows us to move into our own futures or to move back into our past. And it teaches techniques that allow an individual to center themselves and to have these kinds of experiences. It addresses not just things like remote viewing, the ability to describe person, places, or events, objects from which you're physically or temporally separated. But it shows how those kinds of laboratory techniques can be integrated in a larger context into your life so that it shows you how to tap your own creativity, for instance. It shows you how to work within a group and how groups link together, not only in the typical, well understood sort of physical, we sit around a table and talk, but also how shared intention plays a role and creates non-local linkages that are critical to social transformation. So this is a workshop for anybody that is interested in exploring an aspect of themselves with which they may not be familiar, or if they are familiar, they'd like to deepen that understanding, and that also allows people to actually have experiences so that they can take away from our time together in the workshop not just techniques but experiences that will illuminate and guide their lives.
Can you share a story, one of the most moving stories you've heard from a participant?
Oh, well, yes, absolutely. I'll tell a story about a young doctor who had just finished her residency. She was the daughter of a friend of mine that I'd known for a long time. I'd known her since she was a child. And this is a technique we're going to do in the workshop called Looking into Your Future, which is an adaptation of the laboratory protocol for remote viewing. And she had just finished her residency and had been offered postdoc fellowships at Harvard, Yale, Cornell, and Pacific Medical Center in San Francisco. And all her friends, of course, said, oh, go to Harvard or go to Yale. Those are the big schools. And she went around and interviewed, was set up interviews. And before she did the interviews, she came down to see me in Los Angeles, where I was living then, and said, you know, I don't know what to do. There's just there so many opportunities. I don't know what the best one is. And I said, well, let's do a Looking into Your Future session. So she lay down on a couch, and I took her through the session, which is a visualization to help you relax, and then literally to move yourself forward in your own timeline. And I started out by, as I do, by saying, well, you're standing in front of the place where you live, and describe it for me, and she did, and go into that place and describe it, and she did, and I said, okay, you're now spending your time at the place where you spend most of your working day. And she described that, and it had a very particular kind of entrance. And I said, well, go into the building. And she went in, what do you see? And she described that. And I said, well, she said, there's an elevator. I have to get up in an elevator. So I said, well, okay, go up in the elevator. And she went up in the elevator, and when the elevator doors opened in her session, she looked out in her mind and said, oh my goodness, there's this painting and it has this big red swath across it. And I said, well, is there anybody around? And she said, oh, here comes this man. He's a kind of stocky, he's built like a wrestler. He's got a sort of reddish blonde beard, and he takes me down to where I'm working. And I said, is there a window? And she said, oh yeah, yes, there's a window. And she described the office. I said, well, look out the window. What do you see? And she said, well, I see this church steeple. And I said, well, make a little drawing of it. And so she made a little drawing. And she went on to provide more details. Anyway, she went off to her interviews. And she started at Harvard. And they made her an offer. And she went to Yale, and they made her an offer. She went to Cornell. They made her an offer. And these were, from on paper, these were the best, really, that you could possibly hope for as a young physician. And the Pacific Medical Center was sort of her fallback position because, although a very excellent institution, it's not at the level of the others. And when she got to this interview, which she almost didn't do, she thought, well, geez, I've had such extraordinary offers. But she had made a commitment. That was part of when I started with her. I said, I want you to make a commitment. You're going to do all of these things because we don't know where this is going to happen. And she said, I got out of the taxi and I looked at the entrance to the building I was to go in, and I realized it was the building that I had seen in my remote viewing. And she walked in, and it was the lobby that she had seen. And she got in the elevator and went up, and she said when the doors opened, there was the painting I had seen. And around the corner came this guy to meet her, and he was a stocky wrestler who had a sandy, reddish blonde beard. And he took her down. He said, this is where you'll be working. He took her down to the labs and then to her office. And she said, I looked out the window, and there was the church steeple. So she said, even though on paper it didn't seem like the best call, because of this experience, I decided that that's what I would do. And so she took that job. And after she had been in it for a little while, doing the research, she had gotten very interested in AIDS. She had some friends that had contracted AIDS. And this was sort of just before the drug cocktail was developed, and so people were dying, in enormous numbers. And she went to her boss and said, I want to do a study of therapeutic intention healing, which is a subject we cover in the workshop, and I show you how to do it. I want to do a study on healing in AIDS. And her, the senior guy thought about it for a little while and said, okay, let's do it. And she said, as I left his office, I realized that if I had taken the appointment at any of the other schools, if I'd gone in and said, I want to study how the consciousness of one person can have a therapeutic effect on the well-being of the others, they would have dismissed me out of hand. They would have said, this isn't the kind of thing we do at this school. But she said, it was San Francisco. They were more open. And she went on and did that study, which was published in a major medical journal. And she suddenly became an internationally known research physician. And she wrote me and said, I recognize now that if I had taken the appointments at any of the other medical schools, they never would have let me do this study. And if I hadn't done this study, I'd just be another postdoc researcher, starting a career out. And instead, I'm getting invitations from all over the world to come and talk about this at medical conferences. So I have collected a number of these stories. One other that's kind of amusing is I was scheduled to do a radio interview before I was teaching the workshop. And the woman who called me up, who was going to interview me, and who told me quite candidly she thought the whole thing was nonsense. She didn't believe a word of it. I said to her, well, let me send you the Looking Into Your Future CD that I've made for people to use. So I sent her the CD before the interview, and she wrote me an email and said, I got to tell you, I just don't believe any of this. But I was listening to your CD, and I had told her this isn't something you listen to like a music background. You have to, it's a participatory experience. And of course, she didn't do that at all. She didn't pay any attention to that. She said, I had this thing running in the background while I was doing something else, and I happened to hear you say you're standing in front of the place where you live a year in the future. And she thought, aha, here's a test. Because she wrote me, my husband and I had just put an offer in on a house. And I knew exactly where I was going to be living in the future. Or I thought I did. And so I stopped and I followed your instructions on the CD. And when I did so, I was standing in front of a one-story house with big glass doors. And I knew the whole thing must be bogus because we had just put an offer in on a two-story traditional house with big wooden doors. And she said the few days afterwards, I got a call from my realtor who said, I'm sorry to tell you that your bid was not accepted. Someone else offered more money. And I suddenly realized that this house that I was sure we were going to be living in, I wasn't going to get. And we were very depressed about this. And then she said, I had a friend who called me up and said, I know this isn't the kind of house you normally would like, but there's a house over, and gave her the address. I really think you ought to go look at it. And she said, so we drove over, and I got out of the car, and I walked up to it, and I realized it was the house I had seen in my Looking Into Your Future session. It was a one-story house, had big glass doors. And I walked in, and it was even better than the original house inside. And my husband and I were both very excited, and we made an offer on the spot. And we're going to close on it right after your interview, which was about a week in the future. And I want you to know that it's changed my perspective. So what we deal with in the workshop are techniques to allow your consciousness to open to aspects that you might not be familiar with, and to do so in ways that can be objectively verified, so that you are the judge of whether it worked or not. I don't have to tell you whether it worked. You'll know.